Greetings and thank you. I wanted to first express my appreciation to the National Bank of Cambodia, Governor Chea Chanto, and also Her Excellency Chea Sere, the Assistant Governor and Director General of Central Banking, and to the Association of Banks of Cambodia, the Chairman, Dr. In Cheni, to all of you for your leadership in promoting and organizing this important conference with the Association of Finance and Technology of Cambodia. I'm honored to be part of this conference and to be joining such a distinguished group of speakers representing very important organizations. You gave me a difficult assignment, however, because talking about the topic of going green, the trends and drivers of sustainable banking and investment in only 20 minutes is a very, very challenging task. And I think you all have been to various meetings and conferences. You know that typically these take hours and sometimes days to talk about these topics. So I will be talking about, as you could imagine, some very high-level discussions and some of the themes. If I can share the screen, let me make sure I can. I would like to keep the discussion to a very high level. And let's start with the global trends and drivers. I think we can all agree that probably the most fundamental global trend and driver that leads us into this question of sustainability and sustainable finance starts with the whole trend of globalization. If we think about history, it's only really in the last 20 years that we can say that globalization has changed just basically everything that we do. And many of those, the impacts of globalization have been positive. Increasing trade and investment has led to rising incomes. It's led to improving health and longer lifespans. It's led to more people being connected to information and education and having a greater global sharing of knowledge. But it's also led to and not solved certain problems, but it's also increased certain problems that we still find ourselves having to deal with today all across the world. Whether those are problems of inequality, of discrimination that still exists, pollution that's plaguing cities, or natural disasters that are coming and increasing as a result of climate change. This year, I think we've all been even more aware of this challenge of shared problems that face us today in a connected world because of the pandemic. Obviously, everybody's been affected by this, but what drives home this connectedness is countries that didn't have high rates of infection. I could think of Thailand, I could think of Cambodia, are still impacted because other places which have higher rates of infection have had to alter their behavior, whether that means they aren't traveling or they aren't consuming certain products or whatever. So we see that even if I was sick, you weren't sick, but you still suffered because of my sickness. And so we're definitely more connected today and more aware of this. The manifestation of that awareness, the best example, is the fact that we've now, as a globe, embraced a set of goals. So there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals that you could say describe today global priorities. And these are the priorities of virtually every country on the planet. Is we're now measuring ourselves against these various goals and 169 targets that underlie these goals. The interesting aspect that I think is most fundamental when we come back to the question of how this is impacting finance and how this is impacting business is that the Sustainable Development Goals, we all realize now, are not just the jobs of governments. We all parts of society have to embrace a responsibility for doing our part in trying to achieve these goals. And I think that captures a fundamental change, what I would call a revolutionary change that's happened literally within the last few years in what business describes as its purpose. And I mean this not only in the way we feel and how we're actually working, but formally describes as a purpose. If we look at the statements by the British Academy or the Business Roundtable as to what is the purpose of a business, our purpose, according to the British Academy, is to solve the problems of people and planet profitably and not profit from causing problems. We look at the Business Roundtable. We see a stakeholder approach, not only customers and shareholders. I mean, when I started work, my first full-time job probably 40 years ago, I thought the purpose of business was to make good products and services, comply with the law, and to make profits for shareholders. If someone had said to me, our job is also to make society better and to solve major social problems, I would not have necessarily understood why that was the case. But today, that is in fact what we've all embraced, I think, across the business community, that we have a broader purpose. And that purpose is to try to make a positive impact. And that phenomenon parallels and is reinforced by the concept of ESG, which I'm sure you've talked about already in the conference, and I'm sure will be talked about more on the panel that follows. But the ESG concept, a framework, if you will, is now driving corporate behavior and it's driving investment behavior pretty much across the planet. We may not be feeling it quite as intensively in Asia up to this point, but I think we all know that now in Asia, this is a rapidly increasing important topic. The environmental, the social, and the governance capabilities of a company to manage its business and to make sure that it can manage environmental risks and also its environmental impacts and minimize those, to be able to manage social risks and create social capital and be able to govern itself effectively is critical. And this phenomenon and this framework is leading to a massive change in how finance is being allocated around the world. I think the numbers, you can find various numbers, they're all big numbers. The number in this particular chart is as of 2018, and it's only gotten bigger. There was $31 trillion invested with sustainable mandates in the world. That could be negative screens, investments not going into certain places that are not considered sustainable, or positive screens, investing positively in companies that are considered more sustainable, but it's a large amount of money. Eastspring Investments, which is Prudential's asset management company, manages about $220 billion as of the middle of this year, signed up to the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. That set of principles, now over 3,000 organizations have signed, directing their investments to be responsible, and that's over $100 trillion of global assets under management. So investment finance is flowing towards sustainability. But it's not just investors that are driving corporate behavior towards ESG, strong, sustainable behavior, but also the rating agencies, regulators. For example, the National Bank of Cambodia, I believe, is a member of the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is being organized by central bankers around the world to make sure that the banking sector is being sensitive to sustainability risks, especially climate risk, but is managing itself in a way that will be able to responsibly deal with those risks and to promote a safer financial system. The international regulators of securities and banking, IOSCO, the regulators of insurance, the International Association of Insurance Supervisors, also have work streams working in the same regard. So whatever amount of trillions you see today that are being directed towards sustainability, I think that is only going to increase in the future. And the trend, which I think, if we picked one theme globally that's going to drive a lot of that in the next few years, it will be around climate change. Obviously, in this talk, I can't go into detail and why this is important, but I think we all know that the current trend of greenhouse gas emissions, if we look at this line going straight up, we know that that trend is not sustainable, and we've already reached a level of concentration of carbon in the atmosphere, which is dangerous, and that has to be brought down or we're going to suffer serious issues, some of which are listed on the right here. And so I think in the next few years, we're going to see increasing attention on that. But in our region, unlike perhaps, say, in Europe or North America, where they've reached a different stage of development, in our region, we have to solve climate change and solve growth issues and poverty issues and financial access issues at the same time. So the challenge we have to address in our region is greater. There's no question about that. And so when I talk about how we can address these things and what sustainable finance can do, I put it in the context of what I call the gig economy. Now, when most people in technology talk about the gig economy, they're talking about the short-term employment economy, such as Grab or Uber. When I say the gig economy, I'm talking about green, inclusive growth. We can't just be green. we also have to grow. And we can't just grow because we have to have inclusive growth. So GIG. And the themes I think will drive that toward a gig economy, a green, inclusive, growing economy in Southeast Asia in the next several years, decade, are 5. And I'll briefly touch on those 5 themes. First, green bonds and sustainable infrastructure. I think we're all, in the financial industry, we're very attuned to the very large projections of finance needed for infrastructure in the future in this region. Over $3 trillion projected from 2016 to 2030 by Asia Development Bank, which is going to be needed for infrastructure. And of course, that infrastructure needs to be sustainable and resilient, and it has to be moving and being financed fast enough to deal with a rapidly urbanizing society. 70 million people moving to cities, or growth of population in cities in ASEAN alone between 2020 and 2030. That's 19,000 people a week increasing in urban environments. So power, transportation, water, sanitation, education, schools and hospitals, etc. A huge need for that. And that needs to be done sustainably. So that's number one theme. I think we're all going to have to work very hard to meet that challenge. Secondly, financing energy transition to move from fossil fuels to clean energy. If I go back to that point about climate change, it's absolutely essential, and you can look at various expert views from science and from energy experts that say we have to find ways to move from fossil fuels to clean energy in order to bend that curve and to bring emissions under control. Many countries, including Cambodia in our region, still rely on fossil fuels and coal for a substantial portion of electricity. And that's something which we really have to continue to work on, and it will take efforts of energy regulators, of bankers and insurance and other long-term investors in order to be able to work toward that energy transition. This is an issue not just of the climate, this is also an issue around financial risk. So financing a fossil fuel power plant, or particularly a coal power plant today, a lot of people would not want to do that because of pure risk reasons. That right today, renewable energy is becoming cheaper than coal, and so a few years out, either for climate reasons or pure competitiveness reasons, that may not be a viable investment. So there's the issue of stranded assets, which the financial system has to manage. So financing that energy transition and finding ways to do that, it will be a key theme. And it's not just a matter for the energy sector. It's also a matter for the entire economy. And the reason I say this is going back to this point about ESG, and many corporations now working very hard to be able to meet the needs of those various stakeholders, greening supply chains becomes one of the most important themes for many, many corporations. And so going forward, for any country for whom exports is an important part of economic strategy, how green those exports are will become a competitive issue. If there's a global supplier of a product, it will be looking to find sources of supply, whether those are raw materials or components or finished goods, that are produced with low carbon energy. This year, the EU ASEAN Business Council did its annual business sentiment survey, and 47%, almost half of the companies around the region who responded, said they are rethinking their supply chains. Now, we know that rethinking supply chains, some of that's being driven by trade frictions, some by economics, but one thing they're going to be thinking about as they choose their sources of supply is, will this supplier be able to supply me with green product? Because I'm going to have to report on to my shareholders and my other stakeholders and my investors that my supplier is green. So it's very important for the whole economy that this issue of energy transition and sustainability and sustainable finance to help make this happen is something we all have to think about in order to preserve competitiveness. And there are discussions being held in Europe today around whether or not there will be actual border adjustments, meaning extra charges added to imports for their carbon content. Now, that's an issue being discussed in Europe right now, but I think if you look at countries even in our region, China, Japan, Korea, there are discussions now about setting up carbon markets and pricing carbon. So I think within the decade, we're going to see very, very serious implications for competitiveness of industry, for export industry, around this question of being able to show we're producing what we produce in an energy efficient and green way. The next theme I will point out, and it's just been talked about by the previous panel, so I don't need to labor it at all, is around financial inclusion and access to financial security. When I say financial security or health security or retirement security, I'm talking about the full range of issues around financial inclusion. This goes back to what I said, green inclusive growth. This is very fundamental, and it'll be a major factor in driving it. I was pleased to see the statement of the Bankers Association around becoming a leader in the Mekong area in sustainable finance, and financial inclusion is the core of that, and I'm sure this conference has been good illustration of that, importance of that. And of course, for Prudential, you'll see very clearly our purpose is to provide access to health care to everybody. So the ability to do that, collaborating with others in an inclusive way, is fundamental to our mission. And finally, my fifth theme is around transition assistance for affected workers. I think this is an area where it's going to take enormous collaboration, because when we talk about the first four trends that are going to drive sustainable finance and create needs for us to work with our customers to help them get through this transition and to make it possible, there are going to be business models and sectors of an economy which will have to change. And whether that's because of technological disruption or because of new climate-friendly regulations or other international competitive reasons, there are going to have to be transitions. And the countries I think that will come through this best are the ones that can provide effective transition assistance efficiently and quickly to workers, provide credit for starting new businesses, provide assistance for communities to reposition the nature of their economy. And I think technology will be a great enabler of that, both for creating the jobs of the future, but also, for example, having the ability to retrain, provide education and training services digitally to people on a very, very efficient and low-cost basis, so that it makes retraining and jobs of the future available to everybody. Being able to do that is something which I think is very much fits the spirit and capabilities of Cambodia. I wish I could have visited this year. I couldn't, obviously, because of the pandemic. But in my many visits in the past, one of the things that's impressed me most is the way that the country can move quickly, and the incredibly talented young workforce and the innovation that's going on there. I think the examples of the companies and innovations that have come up in this conference are proof of that. So in conclusion, I will just say that I'm very optimistic, and with the leadership of the National Bank of Cambodia, the Bankers Association, and the many companies that are involved in this conference today, that it's going to be possible for Cambodia to rise to the occasion and to benefit from these five themes, and to show real leadership in positioning the economy that can provide green, inclusive growth for the next decade. And it'll be a pleasure to help and collaborate in that side by side along the way. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and I wish you the best, and best luck for the panel for taking this subject further. Thank you.